Well, hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be discussing something that has been in the news recently, which is a war in the Middle East. Now, we're not really going to be talking about the war itself. We're more so going to be discussing why this war happened, because this sort of has seemed to blindside everybody, and they are left without context to appreciate why this historically unprecedented event has taken place. So, let's get into it. So first of all, it's important to understand that Israel and Iran have been in a 46-year-long Cold War lasting from 1979 to 2025. So this conflict is nothing new, but what is new is its shift from being a Cold War to a hot one. And this escalation is mostly because the balance of power has shifted significantly into Israel's favor, mostly with the demise of Hezbollah and Assad's Syria as military forces. But to understand the Israel versus Iran conflict, which is essentially episode 2, we need to understand episode 1, which is the Israel versus Arab conflict, which took place between 1948 and 1979. So let's go back a little bit. Now, a lot of times there's this temptation to see the war as a war of religion, which is one that cannot be explained and one that cannot be stopped. It is simply the nature of Jews and Muslims to be fighting with each other. But this really is not the case. It's very important to understand this conflict as a war of nationalism, a war of politics, not a war of religion. Now, of course, religion has a significant effect on everything, but it is not the dominating factor. It is, in essence, a competition between Arab nationalism on one side and Jewish nationalism on the other, also known as Zionism. Now, these nationalistic movements sort of came from a major transition point that took place in the 18th and 19th century, which was the death of the age of empires and the beginning of the age of nations. And so the death of an empire is where this begins. So we go to the Ottomans. Now, the Ottomans took Jerusalem in 1516 and essentially maintained control over both Arabs and Jews, who were both subservient to the Turks in Turkey. Now, this empire would last for about 400 years, but the Ottoman Empire found themselves in a great deal of decline, incapable of creating their own weapon systems as such technology advanced. And thus, the Ottomans had to find themselves an industrial power to align themselves with to keep up with the times. And so they looked around on the market and found that the producer of the best rifles in the world at the time was the German Empire, and so they aligned themselves with the Germans. So naturally, when World War I rolled around, whose side they were going to be on was an easy choice. Now, unfortunately for the Ottomans, the Germans would end up losing this war, but not quickly. The war was an incredibly intense affair, and halfway through it was not clear who was going to be the victor, and the British were quite afraid. And thus, the fear of losing the war led them to look for all the support everywhere in the world that they could find. And so the British looked to both the Arabs and the Jews for support, and in order to get the support of the two parties, the British promised an Arab state that would span over all of Arabia and Palestine, and promised a Jewish state in Palestine. Now here was a problem. They had promised the Arabs Palestine, and they had promised the Jews part of Palestine. So this would create a problem, but not before the bigger problem arose. And that was the fact that, well, this war was going to be very expensive, and the best way to pay for expensive things at this point in time was to collect colonies. And thus, while the British had promised all of Arabia to the Arabs, they decided they didn't really quite need all of it, and they would take Iraq for themselves and promised the French Syria and Lebanon. And of course, as our story is concerned, Palestine would be kept under exclusive British control. Now, ultimately, despite making these promises, the British only intended to fulfill the promise made to the French. The Jews would not get a state in Palestine, and the Arabs would not get their unified pan-Arab state. So both Jews and Arabs were upset by this arrangement, as they had been promised things and those promises were not delivered, but the British intended to keep both parties relatively happy. So the Arabs were allowed to rule over Iraq and over Jordan. However, these kings would be subservient to the British, and the British would have, for example, very generous rights over oil sales and the income of such. And while the Jews would not get their state in Palestine, they would be allowed to immigrate into Palestine, and they would be allowed to purchase land. And this is where the problem arose. See, the Arabs were upset that they weren't getting Palestine, and now they're even more upset that these Jews were buying land in Palestine. And this is where the friction begins. There's this idea that the friction has always been there, but really the friction begins in the 1920s. So the land in Palestine was owned by people who didn't live there, and thus when the land was purchased by the Jews, they were often kicking out the tenants who were there, essentially renting the property. Now, this was because the Jews intended to have all that property housing Jewish people, so of course they couldn't have people already living on the land. But these evictions created a problem. It created, according to the 1929 Shaw Commission, which was a British commission to attempt to find why the Jews and the Arabs were not getting along with each other. The commission found that, in consequence, a landless and discontented class is being created, and such a class is a potential danger to the country. The evictions of these Arabs off of the land that they had been farming for a very long time was creating a lot of tension. Now, of course, the amount of land that was being sold to the Jews was quite small, but nonetheless, it was often fairly good land, and there were, of course, prejudices against any sort of Jewish territory. And so the tensions continued to build and build until World War II. Now, World War II had very little to take place in the actual Arab territories, with the exception of Egypt and a brief adventure in Syria. So there wasn't a great deal of fighting. However, the British intended for the region to stay that way, to stay stable as they conducted a major campaign against Nazi Germany elsewhere in the world. And so the British were forced to concede to the more powerful force that was the Arabs. And thus they gave the Arabs what they wanted beginning in 1939, that there would be an extreme limit on Jewish immigration and a ban on the purchasing of land in Palestine by the Jews. Now, this would, of course, become a disaster for the Jewish people because they were no longer able to immigrate out of Europe into Palestine, which would lead to far more loss of life in the Holocaust than would have happened otherwise. However, even though the British had somewhat hurt the Zionist cause, the Zionists nonetheless still had a common enemy with the British, and that was Nazi Germany. So, despite being hurt by the British, the Jews fought side by side with the British throughout the war, because they had a common enemy. And this would end up being advantageous to the Jews because they were able to gain a great deal of military experience and familiarity with the doctrine of the British military. So with the conclusion of the Second World War and the realization by the Allied powers of the extent of the Holocaust and the insanity that had taken place, the situation changed dramatically. No longer was Zionism a reaction to growing anti-Semitism, but a reaction to an apocalyptic anti-Semitic event, the Holocaust. And thus, Jewish survival became existential, and they were no longer interested in negotiating for a state, they were now willing to fight for a state. And the British continued to refuse to give the Jews a state. And thus, now that British power was significantly weakened, the Jews began to fight against the British. And the British were not in a place to fight the Jews. And indeed, how could you fight the Jews after such an event such as the Holocaust? But the British simultaneously did not want to upset the Arabs, so they threw their hands up. They were not going to find a solution to this Palestine problem, and instead gave it to the UN. Now, when the UN took over, they had a couple problems. Number one, once again, the Jewish crisis was now existential, and they were very willing to fight over this problem. However, they had a second problem, which was the Arabs were refusing to compromise at all. The Jews owned about 10% of Palestine, but the Arabs refused to allow this 10% to be created into a state. And more importantly, this 10% was not going to be sufficient for all the Jewish refugees. And so the UN was forced to create a divorce that would leave neither party happy, and a divorce that would lead to war. And a divorce that was very controversial because even though the Jews made up 33% of the population, again, they only had about 10% of the land, but in this UN partition, they were going to get 56% of the territory, which was pretty significant. But again, the UN was anticipating this land being used to house Jewish refugees, so having much more land than was needed for that current population was obvious. However, giving more than 50% was obviously a sting in the eyes of the Arabs. But the Arabs weren't willing to compromise at all anyway, so there really wasn't much to avoid this thing. So, as the Arabs stated, if there was a partition, there was going to be war. And there was now a partition, so there was going to be war. And the intent to fight this war was communicated by Azam Pasha, the first Secretary General of the Arab League, in a newspaper in 1947, where he stated that, I personally wish that the Jews do not drive us to this war, as this will be a war of extermination and momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Tartar Massacre or the Crusader Wars. And thus, the Israel-Palestine conflict began. Thank you for watching, everybody. I hope to have part 2 done before the end of the year, but I'm going to have to switch focus to a different project. So if you enjoyed this, leave a comment or a like. If you didn't, I'm sorry. Any criticisms? This is obviously a very controversial topic, so any sort of inaccuracies, I'm happy to receive and be corrected on. So until next time, I hope you guys are well. Take care.